I've covered this a little bit the other day about what Nick Saban, ESPN's Nick Saban, had to say about Georgia Bulldogs in the NFL draft. He made his debut on the network as a draft analyst that night. Talked about Amarius Mims and Brock Bowers as they were the only two Georgia Bulldogs selected in the first round of the NFL draft. And I covered in that video, hey, he kind of called out Amarius Mims. I'll hit on what he said in a second for those of you who haven't seen it yet. But Mims had a response for Nick Saban calling him out. And call out isn't really the best way to put it. I would say, and things get taken out of context, and I want to address that first right now. For example, I come on here and say things, and it's from an analytical standpoint. It's from a commentary standpoint. It's from an opinion standpoint. And like recently I made a video, a pre-draft video about where I thought the Georgia Bulldogs would land in the draft. And, fans didn't like it when I said that certain guys I thought were going to get drafted this late or weren't going to get drafted at all. Those things ended up happening, yet I was viewed as kind of a villain. Well, Nick Saban is just doing his job and evaluating the prospect that is Amarius Mims. So before we all freak out, and there is a little bit of truth, there's some truth to what Nick Saban said, let's get the full story right with Amarius Mims, and let's hit on the things that they said. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post recapping this situation for you. Situation is a strong way to put it. This little banter between Amarius Mims and Nick Saban. They've met a couple of times over the years, 3 to be exact, only one where Mims actually played much against Nick and his Alabama Crimson Tide, and that was this past year. So he really has barely played against them when you add it all together. Newsletter, I'm linking it down below. I've forgotten in the last couple of videos to tell you, please sign up for our newsletter. Thank you to those who already have. There's a link in the description of this video down below. All you got to do is click on that, give us your email address, and then all of a sudden every day, you're getting news about the Georgia Bulldogs. You're getting notifications about the Georgia Bulldogs. What Nick Saban said. And I do put quotes on the screen sometimes for you guys. I can't put this one. All right, so I'm sorry. I'm going to read. Just stick with me. This is what Nick said about, I'm calling him by his first name. You can call me Ryan if you want. This guy's got all the tools. He's got great size. He's got great power. But it makes you wonder, how did the guy only start 8 games? Like in the SEC Championship game, he only played on the first 15 plays of the game, and then he's out, takes himself out. I don't know what he injured, what he hurt, whatever, but you've got to be a little bit more consistent in your performance if you're going to be a great player and a starter in the National Football League. A little harsh, in my opinion, a little harsh. And, Nick Saban's new to this. Maybe he wasn't completely prepared. I'll defend Amarius Mims here before I get to his response. Here's the thing with Mims. 3-year player at Georgia, 21, 22, 23. Well, 21, he's a tackle. Who are the starting tackles? McClendon and Jamari Salyer and a little bit of Broderick Jones, right? They mixed that around. 2022. Well, Mims might be moving up. Well, Broderick Jones is the left tackle, and he moved up into that left tackle position as the line moved along through time. Right tackle. Amarius Mims didn't win that job. It was Warren McClendon, a guy who had been around for a few years, a little bit older guy, an all-conference performer in Warren McClendon. So you get Mims in there on a rotation basis, the way that Georgia has with its offensive line and the way that it's greatly benefited from rotating its offensive line. You see it. I see him get heavier on doing that more and more over his last 2 years. Mims is part of the rotation. Well, McClendon eventually gets hurt. Later on, starts a couple games at the end in the postseason, right? Plays a lot SEC Championship. Starting in those postseason games against, TCU and Ohio State. And he makes a big impact. He's very good in those games. And immediately already, like if you were to look at NFL mock drafts ahead of time, way too early mock draft 2 years from now, 3 years from now, top prospect rankings 2 years from now, 3 years from now. Well, Amarius Mims was all over the place on that because this guy was a top 10 recruit in high school. Dean and I went down there, the middle of Georgia somewhere. I don't even remember where it was. He was playing for Blakely, and it was not a home game. We went and found them at an away game somewhere. And Mims, I've done it before on camera. I'll do it again. He just stood there and he's just pushing people off. He's just pushing people off. He doesn't have to have technique or anything like that. And I'm not smart enough to evaluate offensive line technique. I'd have to ask somebody I know, which I do know someone that could actually help us out with that. I have a resident offensive line expert on hand. But He plays really well in those games. Finally gets that starting job. It's year 3. You kind of expect one-and-done starter out of Marius Mims. If that's the case, the max amount of games he could have started, if Georgia played 14 this year, plus he was 16 games. So he played in about half of the games he could have started. Started 8 games. He started about 8 out of the 16-ish possible games that he would have started given the circumstances of all of the situation put together. So 50% success rate, not great. Well, what was the injury? It was tightrope surgery, and this guy's 340 pounds and 6'7". Tightrope ankle surgery. He's not Brock Bowers, who got back from it in like 25 days. He's Marius Mims. He's huge. And he had tightrope ankle surgery after week 3. So he starts those first 3 games, and then he misses a month, 2 months, right? Gets back, starts weaving back into the action. Well, what happens? He's just not ready. And what was the story of the SEC championship between Georgia and Alabama a few months ago? It was the fact that some of Georgia's best talent, oh, wait a second, the 3 highest guys in this 2024 NFL draft that they had were not healthy in that game. I'm not making excuses for Georgia. I think Georgia should have won that game. I think that Georgia was the better team regardless. But Brock Bowers, Marius Mims, and Lyle McConkey were all obviously hurt. Mims only plays in the first quarter, right? It just wasn't working. That's what happened. So there's the context for Nick Saban, and I'm sure Nick knows some of that, and this isn't a Nick Saban bass session, but that was the context. Mims' response to what Nick Saban said: everybody has their own opinions of me. I don't really care what he said or what he had to say, honestly. I'm just glad to be a Cincinnati Bengal. He did pay his respect to Nick Saban, called him one of the greatest coaches of all time, and had respect. The quote that I'm reading is not the full quote. I have read the full quote, and he does pay his respect to Nick Saban. That's the story with Marius Mims. This is a guy that in 2022 was going to leave. He was going to leave after his freshman year where he doesn't play. He sees probably right in that spring-ish window when he was getting ready to bounce. This would have been 2 years ago from now. Mims is, he's going to transfer to Florida State. Oh, he's in Tallahassee. He's in the transfer portal. There's pictures of him coming in the airport in Tallahassee, going to visit Florida State, and those go viral. And he didn't bow out from the fight. He ends up coming back to Georgia. He chose to stick around. Well, why would he have transferred? You know what the main reason why he would have transferred was? Well, money was. I didn't even think about the money part. I'm sure that had something to do with it. And we know that Florida State likes to hand out bags, as do a lot of these schools. He wasn't going to start. It was going to be Broderick Jones and Warren McClendon. And that's why all these players are transferring, right? What's the different thing about Marius Mims? He didn't do that. He would have went over there and probably would have still been a first-round pick and been a starter, and he would have been a really good player for a very good Florida State program and team. Just not as good as Georgia's. And the difference is he stuck around. It's kind of the difference that you see with a lot of these guys. Christian Miller just did the same thing. Julian Humphrey did the same thing a few months ago. Carson Beck, I thought on like 4 different occasions the dude was going to bounce, and he didn't. So it speaks a little bit about Georgia's football program, those decisions, and I think it speaks a lot about the young men. In a world where if you're not getting what you want, you can leave and maybe look for greener pastures. And in some cases, I do think that's the best thing that a person can do, and we need to realize that this is a young man's life, that he's making these choices. He's got to make the choices that are best for him. For some people, that's transferring, and people need to get over that. That's how I feel about that. In this case, it wasn't. And I think it talks about the culture of Georgia, that all these guys, even when they really are getting close to bow out, they don't. They don't. I want to know what the conversation's like between Kirby and those players. But Marius Mims claps back. There you go. Kind of probably, I said, it's probably the last video about Marius Mims. So as a dog I was covering, it was fun. Thanks for watching.